The Jewish notion of being a people begins with Abraham. According to their line of thought, God had called them to be his people. And they believed that God promised Abraham that his descendants would form a great nation. But when those Jews were placed in Palestine in 1948 by the British and the Americans, the Jews believed that their promise had been fulfilled. Their story, in my view, is not unique. Many other nations face the same circumstances. The blacks in the Caribbean were forced from Africa, packed on ships, and transported to the Caribbean to labor on slave plantations. Abraham Heschel said of the Holocaust, "No other historic event is remotely comparable, and it is hard to conceive of any future atrocity being so maliciously designed and meticulously carried out on so vast a scale." But I want to say to you that while Heschel writes that of the Jewish society and the Jewish Holocaust, I want to tell you that slavery was just as bad and may even be worse than the Holocaust. More blacks lost their lives through slavery than Jews through the Holocaust. So we look at Abraham today because I believe that the Abraham story is relevant for us as well. God, as the text says, had called Abraham. In order to pursue God's call, Abraham had to say goodbye to his land. The slaves were not so fortunate. They had to say goodbye to their birthplace. Again, the slaves not so fortunate. They could not say goodbye. They had to say goodbye to their father. He had to say goodbye to his father's house and travel to an unknown destination, just as the slaves were brought from Africa to an unknown destination. In describing Abraham's life, one can say it was a life of disappointment, disappointed hopes, and delayed fulfillment. And yet, in the Torah, Abraham is described as one who died in a good old age and was old and satisfied. And why was this so? Because the promise that God made to Abraham, that his descendants would form a great nation, that promise was constantly under threat. On 2 occasions, Abraham was forced into exile by famine, where his life was in danger. He was promised countless children, as many as the dust of the earth and the stars of the sky. Yet Abraham remained childless until old age. And then God told him to send away the son, Ishmael, he had by Sarah's handmaid Hagar. And if that were not enough, God told him to sacrifice his only son, Isaac, whom he had with Sarah. The very son whom God had told him would be his spiritual heir and bearer of the covenant into the future. How could that promise be fulfilled? How could that covenant be fulfilled with so many threats? But the threats didn't end there. On 7 occasions, God promised Abraham that he and his descendants would have a land to call their own. And yet, when Sarah died, Abraham did not own a single piece of land, not a square inch, on which to bury her. And he had to enter into a treaty with the Hittites to let him buy a field and a burial cave. And then, by the time Abraham reached 137 years old, he had one unmarried son, no land, no nation. I believe that Abraham lived through some of the darkest periods in any civilization up to then. But Abraham did not complain. It seems as though he realized that God wanted him to walk before him. In other words, God wanted him to act and not to wait on him. God wanted Abraham to do work for himself. And so finally, in his old age, Abraham had 6 sons, and they eventually become the progenitors of many nations. Except for a brief period, though, Abraham did not sit and mourn the past. Instead, he took the first steps towards building the future. And I believe that we can apply this passage about Abraham to what we are celebrating today. During this month of February, we celebrate Black History Month. Today it is here just called African Awareness Month. And I have to be honest with you. Black history is not a concept to which I readily subscribe. I believe that all history has context. History does not occur in a vacuum. The history of the Caribbean did not occur in a vacuum. And if we focus on Black history only, we may very well be shortchanging our citizens, since we may be denying them an accurate picture of the past. I believe that we can highlight the achievements of Blacks. I believe that strongly. But I will not be supporting any false narrative about the past. In addition, many commentators are calling for issues about Black history to be included in the history syllabi of schools. But these are already there. And the way some of us are calling for Black history to be taught assumes that Black history must be taught by Blacks only. This defeats every purpose of teaching history. History is neither black nor white. History is history. And even that I have my problems with. But then again, you will say that I have problems with many things. In teaching or talking about Black History Month does not make blacks become whites or whites become black. But I believe, well, what is needed in the Caribbean is for us to teach history properly and fairly. That is what is needed. And do not listen to the commentators who cannot even give you a definition for history. I believe that for freedom, justice, and equality to permeate our society, then there are some things that we must do. And the first is this. The same words that God said to Abraham, he's saying to us, walk before me and be blameless. A more accurate translation is, walk before me and be perfect. The question is, though, what does that mean? What does that mean? When God says, walk ahead of me, what he is actually saying is, do not wait. Do not wait for me to command you. Take the initiative. Sometimes we have to take the initiative and do what has to be done. Do not just wait until somebody commands you to do it, especially if you know it has to be done. In other words, walk before me. Do not waste time. That's what it means. I believe that human initiative is important. Do not sit and complain. Do something else. You must be blameless. You must be perfect. But what does that mean? In Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and verse 20 we read, surely there is no one on earth so righteous as to do good without ever sinning. So what does it mean to be blameless and to be perfect? You know, it means that we will err. We will make mistakes. We sin, but God forgives. We err, but through our errors we learn. We fall, but God lifts us up. We fail, but the task is not ours to complete. But we should never desist from doing our task. The history of Christianity will show that Christianity is full of guilt. But I'm saying to you that it is also full of forgiveness. And despite what is happening to us, do not think that we are weak and condemned to a life of shame. There is always hope. Despair is not a Christian emotion. We will fail. None of us is perfect. I've always said that when God made the world, he didn't make it perfect. He said it was very good. He never said it was perfect. And what God expects of us in this, our nation, is to do our very best. That's what he's saying. You may fail at doing your best. You may fall, but continue to do your best for your nation. We must have an ethic of responsibility. And going hand in hand with this ethic of responsibility is the idea that more than ever, we have faith in God and God has faith in us. We may disappoint sometimes, but God does not give up on us. He never will. If something has to be done, get up and do it. Do not wait on God or for someone to convince you to do it. Why? Because everything in life takes time. One writer said, there's work to be done, the journey is not yet complete, and it depends on us, we who are now all briefly stride upon the stage of time. We must get up and mend our society. I said, you are not perfect. You will not be perfect. You will never be. But while you have breath, rather than pull down our society, and rather than sit idly by and complain and do nothing, get up, do something, and do your very best. That's the first thing. Secondly, blacks must tell their story. They must tell their story. Blacks must pass on their story. We must tell the story of the men and women on the slave plantations who struggled for freedom from the horrors of plantation slavery. We must tell the story of the early political leaders who fought and labored to establish free societies. We must hand down the story to our children so that they can pass it on to their children and their children's children. The parents must be the one to tell the story. And here, there's a difference between history and memory. You see, passing on the story is important because a people without a past have no future. A person without a past has no identity. So it is important to pass on the story. Again, I quote, the story of the founding fathers, the journey they made, the obstacles they had to overcome, and the vision that drove them are essential elements of a covenantal culture. Retelling the story, handing it on to one's children, and dedicating oneself to continuing the work that earlier generations began are fundamental to the ethos of a society. End of quote. We must never forget who we are and from where we have come. We must even tell the story of why we exist. For if we fail in this endeavor, we will lose our identity. We will lose our purpose for existence. We will lose our soul and become morphed into a people who no longer exist. In other words, we will be fluttering as a chick that has lost its head. If we fail to tell the story of our freedom, we, our children, and our children's children will lose their freedom or in some cases gain it. The fact that blacks throughout the world are still fighting for freedom and equality may very well be an indication that they have not passed on their stories. Here another quotation. The story tells us who we are and who our ancestors hoped we would be. Storytelling is a great vehicle of moral education. And you must also pass that story of your religion. You know, there's a myth going around that the enslaved people did not know about God and did not know about Christianity. Let me say to you, Christianity went to Africa long before it went to Europe. And for those enslaved people, their religion was part of their story. And so they passed on their religion. And in so doing, they pass on their faith. You see, there are some people who tell you that religion is just a social controlling agent. Remember that religion is also a protest. They don't tell you that. A lot of the pseudo-historians that we have today, don't tell you that religion is also a protest. And Christianity has also been a protest. Religion also gives identity, and it shapes the life and culture of a people. In Christian societies, people learn about the birth of Jesus. They learn the Christmas story. They learn about Good Friday and the crucifixion and the resurrection. They learn about Ascension and Pentecost, and that became part of their lives to this day. We sing a lot of Negro spirituals. These were sung by the slaves. Swing low, sweet chariot. Michael, row the boat ashore. Not this Michael here. Michael, row the boat ashore. Blacks emphasize this role of Jesus. They emphasize the humanity of Jesus. When they sang songs like, "Were you there when they crucified my Lord?" They identified with Jesus. They saw in Jesus something that was happening to him, that was happening to them. Blacks look to their freedom from oppression by singing, "I am a child of God, with my soul set free, for Christ had brought my liberty." They saw themselves as the image of God. And they too believe that someday God would intervene in history and allow to live that image. We identify with these. And we sing songs that reenact the Christian story and values associated with them. And they shaped and gave meaning to our lives. Passing on the story of our history is important. We will never be free, no matter how many times we celebrate Black History Month. We will never be free until we pass on our story. But too many parents today do not want to pass on their story to their children. They do not want their children to know what they've been through, their experiences of suffering. That is what we need to do. Pass on our story. You know, there was a time when parents used to pass on their story. People believe that all parents used to do was to flog. But parents had something called a good talking to. You know what I'm talking to? I have always said, a talking to is the worst form of child abuse. You know, sometimes you have to sit down and listen to that story. And, you know, there's something that students should learn. That when those old parents began to tell you a story, they give you a picture of the entire day. If something happened at 5 o'clock in the evening, you have to hear what happened when they got up at 6 o'clock in the morning. Am I right or wrong? And they tell you, I remember that morning, I had a cup of tea. I can't remember if it's Milo or coffee tea, but and they give you, and if it happened, you have to listen to the whole day to what happened. That is telling the story. You know, I prefer something to happen at 5 o'clock, and my grandmother tell me about it after, you know. Because if it happened at 6 o'clock, you got to listen the whole day. And very often, that story had a moral to it. And sometimes when the circumstances comes around again, they tell you the same story, the same way, all over again, and you had to sit and listen as though you were hearing it for the first time. Pass on your story. Some children today need a good talking to. The story was told in schools. It was told on the street corners by the elders in the village. One way or another, the history of the people was taught. And that is why I believe that history must be taught throughout our schools, and that qualification for any award of academic excellence must include a study of history. A nation maintains its freedom through properly and fairly educating its people. We must see ourselves as part of the history. We must identify with those who preceded us. But we must not leave it there. We must also contribute to that story by writing our own and not just depending on celebrations like Black History Month. What we write now, and look at the history, the Christian comparison. What we write now will become what the book of Acts is to the Gospel of Luke. It became the next treatise. Our story today can add it to the others that went before, can become the next treaty. We are Black. We can't change that. But we must keep our story. We must align ourselves to what went before. But we must also be conscious of memory. I just said that memory and history are two different things. Yes, history is important. But for us, memory is also important. People who cannot celebrate Emancipation Day, so they call it Juneteenth. Y'all know that, right? They call it Juneteenth in America. Why? Because emancipation in the United States of America was used as a pawn to free blacks. Abraham Lincoln didn't want to free the slaves. Abraham Lincoln said to the southern states when they broke away from the Union, if you return to the Union, you can keep your slaves. That's what Abraham Lincoln said. But yet they hail him as the great abolitionist. I'm teaching you a good lesson this morning in history. That is what we have. So they now call it Juneteenth. No, we need to go to August and say, this is Remembrance Month, or this is the season of remembrance. Thirdly, if we want to maintain our freedom, then we must stop seeing ourselves as victims. We, as Black people, have developed a culture of victimhood. Victimhood is when you say, it always happening to me. Why me? Everything that comes about, poor me. Blacks believe that they have been victimized so long that they see victimization as their eternal fate, and therefore they have condemned themselves to it. Walk before me. Get out of it. Get out of it. We must desist from seeing ourselves as slaves in perpetuity. We cannot allow or continue to see ourselves as slaves, or everything that happened to us we blame slavery for. Take responsibility for your actions. Let me tell you something. The enslaved people were real victims. They deserve our empathy, our sympathy, our compassion, and our care. But there's a difference between being a victim and seeing yourself as a victim. Being a victim is what happened to you. Seeing yourself as one is how you define who you are and what you are. Let me tell you something about those enslaved people in the Caribbean. They never allowed slavery to define them. Slavery was something that happened to them, but they never allowed slavery to define who they were. They continue to see themselves as conquerors, not as victims. That is why they protested the system. And that is why the women did it every day. If you continue to be a victim, or to see yourselves as victims, you help to maintain the systems and structures that put you there in the first place. They keep you in check and prevent you from progressing. Walk before me and be blameless. If we continue to see ourselves as victims, then you are victims of something out of your control. You will find yourselves fighting against any changes in the system to improve your condition. And I'm afraid a lot of us are doing it now. And therefore, you will have to wait on things like the celebration of Black History Month. But there's one other thing. I've heard people saying, or people say, that a lot of the diseases we have today are so much ingrained in us now from the days of slavery. Hypertension, diabetes, because of the food that our ancestors had on the plantation. But my God, there are all kind of health tips these days. We should know how to take care of ourselves. If you have diabetes, are you going to say, my ancestors had it and I have it too? Or are you going to do something about it? That is what we have to do. Stop seeing ourselves as victims. Because we continue to see ourselves as victims, a lot of us, especially the men, have lost confidence. They've lost their identity. And that is what the protest throughout the world is all about. Blacks fighting for their identity, fighting for their freedom. We have lost confidence in ourselves. A lot of men have lost confidence. And that is why the women are moving ahead of them. I have to be very frank of what I've been noticing. Men these days, or some men, don't even know how to talk to the ladies. And we men are intimidated by confident, intelligent women. I've noticed that, even from school. We must be able have conversation with our female counterparts. Too many of our males are dropping off their female partners at university and going on to do something else. I want to say something to men this morning. Be men, especially, give our girl children confidence, you know. We are responsible for that. But if they take the confidence, let the males also take some confidence. Stop seeing yourself as victims. Walk ahead of me. That's what the message is. Walk ahead of me. I know my grandmother used to look at me and tell me, look at my eyes and declare yourself. I got to look at her and talk. So I learned to use words. Because if I have to talk to a lady, I must use words. I must tell her that her pulchritudinous disposition is so mesmerizing that I cannot even think. I must tell her that she is a combination of art and history. And that when the sun rose this morning, it took its cue from you. That is why it is so bright. Yes. You can ask her. I mean my daughter. That's my daughter sitting there, so I mean her. Don't think I mean somebody else. But we must have confidence. You see me? I feel that I'm the greatest thing there is. But it's up to you to feel the same way too. You must feel that way. Don't depend on the celebration of Black History Month. Walk before me. Have confidence. And fourthly, focus on the future. We must look to the future. We must build a future. That is what Abraham was called to do, to build a future. Walk before me. Do something. It is when you build the future that you then remember the past. Look to the future. The freedom that God has granted us is found in the future. Why? Because God is the God of the future. When Moses asked God to identify himself to him, you know what God said to Moses? You know what he said to Moses? The Bible says, I am that I am. But that is not the correct translation. That's not what it means. It means, I will be what I will be. So from now on, don't let the boy tell you, I am that I am. I will be what I will be. God is a God of the future. The prophets pointed to the future. Isaiah pointed to the time when the calf and the lion and the calf will lie down together. Oh, that was a utopian peace that he was looking at. Because anytime the calf and the lion lie down together, neither of them is going to be sleeping. No, they will not sleep. And if they do sleep, each will sleep with one eye open. We cannot change the past, but we can change the future. If we continue to look to the past and live in the past, we will always see ourselves, or always be objects willing to be used. But if we look to the future, we see ourselves choosing moral agents, directing the path that we should go. So Black History Month, tearing down statues and protesting will not solve the problems that we face. Any change must come from within us, both black and white. We must never allow ourselves to be prisoners of the past. We should never condemn ourselves to repeating the past or allowing the past to balk us forever. Our attitude should be, never again shall slavery and its first cousins, inequality, injustice, racism, and a lack of freedom happen to us. And finally, what shall we do? First of all, I believe that blacks and whites must live in this society together. Both blacks and whites must be treated with dignity and respect. If we want to create a free society, those who are considered the oppressors must assist in creating that society. A society in which everyone has that dignity and respect. We must not just be tolerating people. You know, there are some people don't like you at all, but they just tolerate you. Not just tolerate people. Somebody was telling me that this morning. We must not just tolerate people who are of different racial, ethnic backgrounds, different classes and creed and sexual orientation. We must not just tolerate them. We must see them as being made in the image of God. They are human beings, and human life is sacred. We must respect the sanctity of life. We must respect people's right to be free and equal individuals. How can whites expect to gain the respect of blacks if blacks do not respect blacks? If the whites do not respect blacks. One does not gain respect by insisting upon it or by using force. Respect must be earned. That is why it is called respect. And therefore, leaders and those who administer justice must ensure that legislation is in place to protect blacks and all those who are discriminated against, and to protect whites and the rights of equality and freedom of all individuals. What must we do? Walk before me. If we are to create a free society, and if this world must live in peace, then we must make some adjustments to capitalism. Because inherent in capitalism is disparities, discrimination. That's inherent. Racism. You see, the capitalist system cannot exist without these. It may call for a political revolution, not in the sense of violence, but in a deliberate transformation of the system and hence society itself. So whites have work to do. But blacks also have work to do. We must assume full responsibility for our lives. Human beings seek good health, happiness, freedom, equality, food, clothing, and shelter as the necessities of life, and hence the possibility of achieving them allows humans to look to the future with optimism and hope. Blacks must stop being in this state of apathy. Otherwise, they will continue to be victims. Blacks must respect blacks as well. Black Lives Matter must not only be a clarion call to white people, it must be a clarion call to black people as well, because we must respect one another. We cannot be calling for racial justice by whites when at the same time we are murdering one another and committing all sorts of acts of violence against one another. We do it. And right now I'm not hearing people crying out about blacks murdering one another, but let one white man just touch a black man and we will hear about the racism. I'm not afraid to say these things because they are true. Why are we not incensed by the murders that we are committing against ourselves? We must never send the message that it is okay for blacks to violate blacks, but we cry out as victims of oppression when it is reversed. Malcolm X said, there can be no black-white unity until there is first some black-black unity. We cannot think of uniting with others until we are first united with ourselves. We cannot think of being acceptable to others until we have first proven acceptable to ourselves. I'm saying to you this morning that this Barbadian society is for all of us. Together, we must try to eliminate all that beset us, all that stops us from living our image and the image that God created us to be. This society is for all of us. Freedom is a gift for all races. It is a natural right by divine creation. When God made us, He gave us the right to be men and women, to be ourselves. Blacks can continue to fight, but we must see ourselves as part of the problem. I'm saying to you, this land is your land. This land is my land. Together, we shall all strive to ensure that Barbados is a place for blacks and whites to live comfortably and in union with one another. That is why, if we want to talk about culture, about awareness, then it is more apt for us to look at cultural awareness, where we have all groups in society contributing to the existence of our culture. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.